Sometimes, you wake up and realize your life isn't your own anymore. The silence is deafening, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning or the faint chirp of birds outside. That's how it's been for me lately. My name's Emily, and I live in a quiet suburb of Santa Monica, California. To anyone looking in, my life seems ideal. A spacious house with a sparkling pool, a hardworking husband, and a 17-year-old son, Ryan, who's finishing high school. But the truth is, I feel invisible. My husband, Mike, spends most of his days at the office. When he comes home, he's either glued to his laptop or scrolling through his phone. Our conversations are short, functional, questions about bills or Ryan's college plans. I can't remember the last time he truly looked at me, let alone touched me in a way that reminded me of who we used to be. Ryan's no better. He's a teenager, always lost in his music or playing video games with friends. I can't blame him for retreating into his own world. It's what I would have done at his age. Still, there are moments when I catch him looking at me like he's trying to figure something out, like he can sense the cracks forming beneath the surface of our family. The house, though beautiful, feels like a gilded cage. I clean, organize, and tend to the garden, but there's always this emptiness. The sparkling pool that once felt like a dream now reflects a life that's drifted into monotony. That all changed the day Chris arrived. Chris is Mike's 19-year-old nephew, visiting for the summer while his parents sort out some issues back home in Seattle. I barely remembered him from family gatherings, but when he showed up at our doorstep with his easy smile and confident demeanor, it was like a jolt of electricity ran through the house. "Hi, and Emily," he said, slinging his duffel bag over one shoulder. He had this effortless charm, the kind you only see in young men who haven't yet been beaten down by life. His blue eyes sparkled with something, curiosity, maybe, and his tousled dark hair gave him the look of someone straight out of a college movie. "Chris," I said, smiling despite myself. "Welcome. You'll be staying in the guest room." Ryan seemed thrilled to have him around. The two of them spent hours by the pool, tossing a football back and forth or blasting music loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I watched from the kitchen window as Chris joked with Ryan, his laughter ringing through the yard. But it wasn't just his laughter that I noticed. It was the way he carried himself, the way he seemed completely at ease in his own skin. I couldn't help but think about how different he was from Mike, who now seemed more like a shadow in our lives than a partner. One afternoon, while Ryan was out with friends, Chris wandered into the kitchen where I was preparing dinner. He leaned against the counter, his damp hair curling slightly from the pool. "Need any help, Aunt Emily?" he asked, flashing that disarming smile. "No, thank you," I replied, keeping my eyes on the vegetables I was chopping. "You should enjoy your summer." But he didn't leave. Instead, he stayed, asking me about my day, about the house, about anything and everything. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was actually listening to me. I told myself it was harmless. He was just being polite, a guest trying to make conversation. But as the days passed, I started to notice things. How his gaze lingered a second too long when we spoke, how he always seemed to find a reason to be near me. One evening, after dinner, I stepped outside to watch the sunset. The sky was streaked with oranges and pinks, the kind of view that takes your breath away. I didn't realize Chris had followed me until he spoke. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice low. I turned to see him standing just a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Yes," I finally replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It is." The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy. I could feel his eyes on me, and for the first time in years, I felt truly seen. The moment passed quickly. Ryan burst through the back door, yelling about some game he'd won with his friends, and the tension evaporated. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I didn't know it then, but that moment on the porch was only the beginning. Chris's arrival felt like the universe threw a stone into the still waters of my life, creating ripples that reached places I didn't even know were stagnant. He wasn't loud or overbearing, just present in a way that was impossible to ignore. He settled into the guest room without much fuss, but his presence quickly filled the house. He and Ryan became inseparable, playing basketball in the driveway, challenging each other to video games, and lounging by the pool on lazy afternoons. I'd often hear their laughter through the open windows, and for a moment, it felt like the house had a pulse again. But it wasn't just Ryan he charmed. Chris had this way about him, a quiet confidence that wasn't cocky but self-assured. It was in the way he carried himself, how he made everyone feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. Even Mike, in his limited appearances, seemed to enjoy Chris's company, chuckling at his jokes over dinner before retreating to his office. As for me, I noticed things I shouldn't. The way the sun caught the gold flecks in his dark hair as he sat poolside. The slight curve of his smile when he teased Ryan about missing a basketball shot. The way his voice lowered just a touch when he said, "Good morning, Aunt Emily," as he strolled into the kitchen, shirtless, with a towel slung over his shoulder. It wasn't intentional, I told myself. I was just lonely, and he was new, a fresh energy in a life that had grown dull. But I couldn't deny the way my gaze lingered a second longer than it should have, or the way my pulse quickened when he casually leaned against the counter, talking about his plans for college. One afternoon, I found him in the backyard, repairing the wooden gate that had been sticking for months. Mike had promised to fix it but never found the time. Chris worked without complaint, his brow furrowed in concentration as he hammered the warped wood into place. "Need some water?" I asked, stepping out onto the patio with a glass in hand. He looked up, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the hem of his shirt, revealing a glimpse of toned skin beneath. "Thanks, Aunt Emily," he said, taking the glass with a grateful smile. "You're really good at this," I said, gesturing to the gate. Mike never got around to it. He shrugged. "I like fixing things. It's satisfying, you know? Seeing a problem and solving it." The simplicity of his answer caught me off guard. When was the last time someone in this house had talked about solving problems instead of avoiding them? I stood there a moment too long, watching as he turned back to his work, his hands deft and precise. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat felt dry. That evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, Chris walked into the kitchen. Ryan had already disappeared to his room, and Mike was buried in his laptop. "Thanks for letting me stay here," he said, leaning against the counter. "I know it's probably a lot having another person around." I waved him off, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're no trouble, Chris. It's nice having some life in the house." He smiled, and for a brief moment, I felt like I was the only person in the room. "Well, if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he'd already done more than he realized. But instead, I nodded and turned back to the sink, pretending to focus on the plates in front of me. As the days passed, I noticed how often our paths seemed to cross. In the kitchen, where he'd linger over a glass of water while I cooked. By the pool, where he'd look up from his book and flash me a smile that felt too warm to be casual. Even in the quiet moments, when he'd sit on the porch steps while I watered the garden, his presence felt magnetic. One night, after Ryan went to bed, I stepped out onto the patio. The air was warm, the sky a blanket of stars. I hadn't expected Chris to still be awake, but there he was, sitting by the pool with his feet in the water. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, startled to find him there. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Just needed some air." "What about you?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "The house feels too quiet sometimes." He nodded, and for a moment, we just sat there, the silence between us comfortable and unnerving all at once. "I hope I'm not making things too crowded," he said finally, his voice low. "Not at all," I replied, and I meant it. If anything, his presence had made me realize just how empty the house had been before he arrived. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of him by the pool, his face lit by the soft glow of the moon. Something was shifting, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for where it was headed. It started with the kind of moments you'd think nothing of at first. A glance across the room that lasted just a second too long. A smile that felt a little too genuine. Chris had this way of catching my eye and holding it, like he was waiting for something or daring me to notice. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was my imagination. I'd been setting out drinks for Ryan and Chris by the pool when I glanced up and saw him watching me. He didn't look away, didn't even try to hide it. Instead, he smiled, that disarming, confident smile that made him seem older than his 19 years. "Thanks, Aunt Emily," he said, taking the glass from my hand. His fingers brushed mine, and though the touch was brief, it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. Later that week, it was a casual compliment. I'd been out in the garden all afternoon, pruning roses and sweating under the California sun. When I came back inside, Chris was in the kitchen pouring himself a glass of water. "You're always working so hard," he said, leaning against the counter. "Most people would have let that garden go by now, but you keep it beautiful. You're amazing." The words were innocent enough, but the way he said them, low and steady, with a hint of admiration, made my stomach tighten. I laughed it off, brushing my hair back and muttering something about needing to stay busy, but my hands trembled as I washed them at the sink. The tipping point came one evening. Mike was working late again, as usual, and Ryan had gone to a friend's house for the night. I didn't expect to see Chris when I stepped out to the patio with a glass of wine, but there he was, lounging by the pool with his feet in the water, his shirt tossed aside. "Didn't know anyone was out here," I said, startled. "Sorry, Aunt Emily," he said, sitting up. "Didn't mean to scare you. I just wanted some fresh air." I waved off his apology and hesitated before sitting down in the lounge chair next to him. The air was warm and still, the only sounds the faint hum of cicadas and the occasional splash as Chris kicked at the water. For a while, we didn't talk. The silence between us felt loaded, as if words might tip it over into something I wasn't ready to face. But then he spoke. "You seem different lately," he said, his voice soft. "Different?" I echoed, pretending not to understand. "Yeah." He paused, looking at me with those piercing blue eyes. "I don't know. Like you're carrying something. Like you're not happy." The honesty in his tone caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had noticed how I felt, let alone cared enough to ask? "I guess I've been a little tired," I admitted, swirling the wine in my glass. "Life isn't always what you expect it to be." Chris nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "You deserve to be happy, Aunt Emily. You really do." There was something in the way he said it, like he believed it more than I did. I looked away, focusing on the ripples in the pool instead of the warmth creeping up my neck. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The air between us felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. I could feel his gaze on me, and when I finally turned back to him, he didn't look away. "You're amazing, you know that," he said, his voice lower than before. "Chris," I started, but I didn't know what I was about to say. In that moment, I wasn't Emily, the wife or the mother. I wasn't the woman who spent her days folding laundry and organizing grocery lists. I was just a person, a woman being seen for the first time in years. The spell broke when the patio light flickered, pulling me back to reality. I stood quickly, setting my glass down on the table with a shaky hand. "It's getting late," I said, avoiding his eyes. "Good night, Chris." He didn't say anything, just nodded as I walked back into the house. But as I closed the sliding door behind me, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. He was still there, watching me, and for the first time, I didn't look away. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed our conversation over and over. I told myself it was nothing, just a friendly moment between family. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and there was no undoing it now. That night felt like every other, at least at first. Mike texted to say he'd be late, the same message I'd read countless times before. Ryan had gone to a friend's house for a sleepover, leaving the house unusually still. I wandered aimlessly from room to room, trying to find something to fill the silence. I was wiping down the counters in the kitchen when Chris walked in. His hair was damp, a towel draped over his shoulders from a late swim. "Hey, Aunt Emily," he said, flashing me that easy smile. "Chris," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Did you eat? I could make you something." He shook his head. "No, I'm good. Just needed a swim. Helps me think." I nodded, sensing he wanted to talk. "Everything okay?" He hesitated for a moment, leaning against the counter, his hands gripping the edge. "Yeah, just thinking about things." I set down the cloth I'd been holding. "What kind of things?" Chris looked at me then, really looked at me, his expression open and unguarded in a way that made my stomach twist. "You," he said simply. "Me?" I repeated, unsure if I'd heard him right. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're incredible, you know that? You're always taking care of everyone, keeping this house running, making sure Ryan and Uncle Mike are okay. But who's taking care of you?" I froze, his words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. "Chris, that's sweet, but—" "I mean it," he interrupted, stepping closer. "You deserve more than this. More than being taken for granted." I looked away, my hands trembling as I gripped the counter. "Chris, you don't understand. This is just life. Marriage. It's not always perfect. That doesn't mean it should make you feel invisible," he said, his voice softer now. His words hit me like a tidal wave. How long had it been since someone had noticed me? Really seen me? I'd spent so much time convincing myself that my life was fine, that the cracks didn't matter. But now, standing here with Chris, I felt something I hadn't in years, a spark of warmth, of being wanted. "Chris," I said, my voice shaky. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, taking another step closer. "Because it's true?" I turned to face him, and for a moment, the air between us felt electric, charged with everything we weren't saying. His gaze held mine, steady and sure, and I felt my resolve slipping. "I think you should go," I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't move. "I can't," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Not when I feel this way." I didn't know what to say, how to respond. My mind screamed at me to end it, to walk away, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor. For the first time in so long, I felt alive, terrified, but alive. Chris took one final step forward, his hand brushing mine. It was the gentlest of touches, but it sent a jolt through me, breaking whatever illusion of control I had left. I need to think," I stammered, pulling my hand away. "This isn't right." He nodded, stepping back but not looking away. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Aunt Emily. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." I swallowed hard, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions surging inside me. "We'll pretend this never happened," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them.
Chris didn't argue.
He simply nodded again, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned and walked out of the room. When he was gone, I sank into the nearest chair, my heart pounding in my chest. My thoughts were a chaotic mess of guilt, confusion, and something I couldn't name. I had crossed a line that night, even if nothing had truly happened. And deep down, I knew there was no going back. The days that followed were a blur of forced smiles and frantic distractions. I threw myself into chores, scrubbing every surface of the house, as if I could wipe away what had happened, or nearly happened, between Chris and me. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment, a lapse in judgment brought on by loneliness. If I ignored it, it would fade. But it didn't. Everywhere I went, he was there. In the kitchen, offering to help chop vegetables even when I didn't need it. By the pool, asking if I wanted him to clean the deck. In the garden, appearing out of nowhere to hand me a watering can with that easy smile. At first, I thought it was harmless, his way of being helpful, of fitting in. But then there were the little things, the ones that lingered in my mind long after they happened. The way his hand brushed against mine when he passed me a plate. The way he'd hold my gaze just a second too long, his expression unreadable. I tried to pull back, to create space between us. I focused on Ryan, asking about his classes and planning dinners he might actually want to sit down for. I even reached out to Mike, suggesting we plan a family outing, something we hadn't done in years. Mike barely looked up from his laptop. Sure, he mumbled, typing away. The rejection stung, but it wasn't surprising. I told myself that this was just how things were now, that I'd made my peace with it long ago. But when Chris walked into the room, grinning as he asked if anyone wanted to play a board game, my resolve wavered. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood by the window, staring out at the pool. The water shimmered under the moonlight, perfectly still. I thought about Chris, his words, his presence, the way he made me feel seen. The guilt twisted in my stomach like a knot, but it wasn't enough to drown out the other feelings swirling inside me. I heard footsteps behind me and froze. "You're up late," Chris said, his voice low. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, as if he'd just rolled out of bed. "Couldn't sleep," I said, my voice barely audible. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Me neither." I tensed, my heart racing as he closed the distance between us. "Chris," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. This isn't a good idea." "What isn't?" he asked, his tone innocent, though his eyes told a different story. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "We can't." "I can't." He smiled faintly, his gaze locking onto mine. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, Aunt Emily. I just like being around you." "You shouldn't," I whispered, the words sounding weak even to me. "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft. "You deserve to have someone who notices you, who listens to you." I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "Chris, you need to stop this. Whatever this is, it's not right." He didn't move for a moment, and I thought he might finally leave. But instead, he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You keep saying that. But you don't believe it, do you?" I spun around, my face flushed with anger, and something I didn't want to name. "You're a guest in this house, Chris. My nephew. This needs to stop." He held up his hands in mock surrender, his expression softening. "Okay, I'll back off. I didn't mean to upset you." But as he turned to leave, he glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes lingering on mine for just a moment longer than they should have. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I told myself I'd drawn a line, made things clear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Chris wasn't just testing boundaries anymore, he was pushing them. And the scariest part? A small, hidden part of me didn't want him to stop. Mike wasn't the kind of man who paid close attention to the small details of our lives, at least not anymore. For years, he'd been preoccupied with work, with emails and spreadsheets that always seemed more urgent than family dinners or weekend plans. But recently, he'd started noticing me in ways I didn't want him to. "Everything okay?" he asked one evening, setting his briefcase by the door. "Of course," I said, too quickly, the lie slipping out before I could stop it. I avoided his eyes, busying myself with folding laundry on the couch. He lingered for a moment, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You seem off lately. Distant." "I'm just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing, and we both knew it. Over the next few days, his questions became more frequent, his gaze sharper. He'd come home earlier than usual, his presence unsettling as if he were waiting for something to reveal itself. I felt like a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap under the weight of his scrutiny. Chris, on the other hand, was anything but subtle. His behavior had grown bolder, his attempts to spend time alone with me more obvious. He'd linger in the kitchen when he knew Mike was in the next room, his smile laced with something unspoken. And I, caught between guilt and the flicker of something I couldn't name, let it happen. The breaking point came one evening when Mike arrived home earlier than expected. I'd been in the living room, sorting through a box of old photos. Chris had wandered in, sitting on the couch across from me. At first, our conversation was casual, small talk about his plans for the future, his classes, and how much he'd enjoyed staying with us. But as the minutes passed, the atmosphere shifted. "You're amazing, Aunt Emily," he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You deserve more than what you're getting." I froze, my breath hitching. "Chris, we've talked about this. You can't keep—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice soft but insistent. "But I can't stop thinking about you." "Chris," I said firmly, standing up. "This has to stop." Before I could say more, the front door opened, and Mike stepped inside. His eyes immediately locked onto us, me standing rigidly by the coffee table, Chris seated too close on the couch. "What's going on here?" Mike asked, his voice sharp. "Nothing," I said quickly, too quickly, as I stepped back. My heart pounded in my chest, the tension in the room so thick it felt suffocating. Mike's gaze shifted between us, his jaw tightening. "Doesn't look like nothing." Chris stood, his expression calm but unreadable. "We were just talking, Uncle Mike." "Talking," Mike repeated, his tone heavy with suspicion. He looked at me then, his eyes narrowing. "Emily, what's going on?" "Nothing," I repeated, my voice shaking. Chris was just. Mike cut me off, his voice rising. "Do you think I'm blind? I've seen the way things have changed around here, the way you've been acting." He turned to Chris, his anger barely contained.
"And you?"
"Staying here, acting like." "Like what?" Chris shot back, his calm demeanor finally cracking. "Like you don't know what you're doing," Mike snapped. "This is my house, my family, and I won't stand for." "Mike, stop," I shouted, my voice breaking. "You're making something out of nothing." But the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe a word I was saying. "Go to your room," he barked at Chris, his voice low and dangerous. Chris hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to me before he finally turned and walked out of the room. When the door to the guest room clicked shut, Mike turned back to me, his expression a mix of betrayal and fury. "What's going on, Emily?" "Nothing," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. "I swear, nothing happened." He stepped closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't see the way he looks at you? The way you let him—" I couldn't speak. The weight of his accusations, of the truth I was too ashamed to admit, left me paralyzed. "You've destroyed us," he said finally, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Tears blurred my vision as I shook my head, unable to respond. Mike grabbed his briefcase, his movements stiff and deliberate. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Don't expect me back anytime soon." And just like that, he was gone, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing through the empty house. I stood there in the silence, my chest tight with guilt and despair. Upstairs, I heard Chris's door creak open, his footsteps hesitant as he came down the stairs. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. "No," I whispered, my tears spilling over. "No, Chris, I'm not." He reached out as if to comfort me, but I stepped back, the space between us now an uncrossable chasm. "Go to bed," I said, my voice cracking. "Just leave me alone." He nodded, his face clouded with regret as he turned and walked back upstairs. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. Everything was falling apart, and there was no one to blame but myself. The morning Chris left, the house felt unnaturally still. He had packed his things early, slipping out the front door without much ceremony. There was no awkward goodbye, no lingering glance, just the quiet click of the door as he walked out of my life. I stood at the window, watching as his car disappeared down the street. A part of me wanted to call him back, to make sense of everything, but the larger part knew it was for the best. He wasn't the problem. I was. The days after his departure stretched into weeks. Mike barely spoke to me, his presence more like a ghost haunting the edges of the house. He stayed in the guest room, leaving early for work and coming home late, avoiding any interaction beyond the necessary. At first, I tried to talk to him, to explain, but my words always died on my lips. What was there to say? Ryan, perceptive in a way I hadn't fully appreciated before, picked up on the tension. He stopped asking if we could have family dinners, stopped suggesting movie nights. Instead, he retreated to his room or went out with friends, the weight of our crumbling family pressing down on him in ways I couldn't fix. One evening, I found myself sitting by the ocean. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, a soothing backdrop to the chaos in my mind. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, but even the beauty of the sunset couldn't calm the storm inside me. I replayed the past months over and over, dissecting every choice, every mistake. I had allowed myself to fall into a spiral of loneliness, clinging to the attention Chris had given me like a lifeline. But in doing so, I'd shattered the foundation of my family. What had I been looking for? Love? Validation? A reminder that I still mattered? The answers didn't come easily, but the questions refused to leave. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the cold sand beneath my hands, grounding me in the present. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry, not just for the mess I'd made, but for the person I used to be, the life I had lost sight of. When I returned home that night, the house was dark and quiet. I paused in the hallway, looking at the closed doors around me. Mike's, Ryan's, the empty guest room. I knew I couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't rewrite the choices I had made. But maybe, just maybe, I could start over. Not for anyone else, but for myself. The first step came the next morning when I found Mike in the kitchen. He was sipping coffee, his expression tired but guarded. "Good morning," I said softly, standing awkwardly by the counter. He didn't look up. "Morning. I know I've hurt you," I began, my voice trembling. "And I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to figure out how to fix this, how to fix myself." For a long moment, he didn't respond. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were weary, but not entirely cold. "You've got a lot to figure out, Emily," he said. "And so do I." It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in the wall I'd built between us. Later that day, Ryan found me in the garden, where I was pulling weeds with more force than necessary. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me. "Mom," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Are we gonna be okay?" I looked up at him, my chest tightening at the worry in his eyes. "I don't know, honey," I admitted. "But I'm going to do everything I can to make things better. For you. For us." He nodded, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding pass between us. As the weeks turned into months, life didn't magically return to normal. The scars of what had happened lingered in the silences at the dinner table, in the way Mike still avoided meeting my eyes. But there were small signs of hope, a shared laugh with Ryan, a tentative conversation with Mike. And me? I spent more evenings by the ocean, letting the waves remind me of one simple truth. No matter how far the tide pulls away, it always returns. Sometimes the hardest part is not confronting others, but confronting yourself. Will I be able to find a way to rebuild what I have broken? Or is it too late?